The rain came down so hard that Alara could not tell where the road ended and the ditch began. Her feet were bare and bleeding, her shawl soaked through, and behind her, torches bobbed in the darkness. Voices shouted her name, calling her a thief, calling her cursed, calling her everything, except what she truly was, a girl with nothing left to lose. She ran until her lungs burned, until the torches grew small behind her, until she stumbled through a broken iron gate and collapsed against a cold stone wall. She had left her village that same night, driven out by men who blamed her for debts her late father had left behind. He had borrowed coin from half the village before he died of fever, and now that he was gone, the villagers wanted someone to answer for it. They had come to her door with sticks and shouting, and she had run before they could do worse. She did not know where the road led. She only knew she could not go back. The gate she had stumbled through belonged to a manor she had heard of only in whispers. Ashcombe Manor, the house of a duke who did not receive visitors, did not attend gatherings, and was rumored to have driven away every servant who ever tried to work for him. The villagers said he was cursed, that his wife had died within these very walls, and that grief had turned him into a man of stone. Alara had heard the stories many times, always told in hushed tones by the fire, always ending with a warning to stay away from Ashcombe land. She had nowhere else to go. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the manor for one bright second. Tall towers, broken shutters, ivy crawling up cracked stone like veins over old skin. It looked less like a home, and more like the skeleton of one. Alara pulled herself up from the mud, her whole body trembling from cold and exhaustion, and made her way toward the stables she could see near the side of the house. If she could not find shelter inside, perhaps she could hide among the horses until morning. The stable door groaned as she pushed it open, and the smell of hay and animals wrapped around her like a blanket. She sank into a corner, pulling loose straw over her legs for warmth, and closed her eyes, telling herself that tomorrow she would think of a plan. Tomorrow she would find work in some distant town where no one knew her name. She did not hear the footsteps until a lantern light fell across her face. "Who gave you permission to sleep in my stable?" The voice was deep, edged with irritation, and belonged to a tall man standing in the doorway, his coat dark with rain, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Alara scrambled to her feet, heart hammering, certain she was about to be thrown back out into the storm. "Forgive me," she said quickly, her voice hoarse from crying and running. "I meant no harm. I was seeking shelter. I will leave at once." "You will leave at once," the man repeated, stepping closer, close enough now that the lantern light revealed sharp eyes and a face carved from years of quiet anger. "In this storm, at this hour, with no shoes on your feet." Alara straightened her spine, refusing to let him see how frightened she was. "I have survived worse than a storm tonight, my lord. I do not fear the rain." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or curiosity, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You know who I am, then?" "Everyone in the valley knows who you are," she answered honestly. "They call you the Duke who chased away the sun from his own house." A low, humorless laugh escaped him. "And yet here you are, seeking shelter under the very roof they warn you about." "Desperate people do not have the luxury of choosing safe roofs," she said. "Only roofs that will not collapse before morning." He studied her for a long moment, the rain drumming steadily against the stable roof, the horses shifting quietly behind them. She expected him to order her gone, to summon a servant to drag her back into the storm, but instead he simply asked, "What is your name?" "Alara." "And why does a village drive out a girl named Alara in the middle of a storm?" She hesitated, unsure how much truth to give a stranger, especially one with such a reputation, but something about his directness, the way he did not soften his questions with false kindness, made her decide honesty was the safer path. "My father died owing money to half the village. They wanted someone to blame. I was the only one left to blame." "So you ran." "I ran," she agreed. "And I will keep running until I find somewhere I am allowed to stay." The Duke, whose name she would later learn was Alistair Ashcombe, folded his arms and looked at her, the way one might study a stray animal that had wandered too far from its herd. "There is no work here for a girl like you. My staff left long ago. What remains of this house survives on habit, not hospitality." "Then let me be useful," she said quickly, before he could dismiss her outright. "Let me stay, even a single night, and I will prove my worth before the sun rises." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Prove your worth how? By mucking stables? By scrubbing floors that have not seen a broom in years?" "By cooking," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Give me whatever remains in your kitchen, and I will make you a meal worth remembering." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm outside. Then the Duke laughed, a real laugh this time, sharp and disbelieving. "You wish to cook for me, a stranger who has been in my stable for less than an hour." "I wish to earn my place," she corrected. "Let me remain, and I will make this house a home again, one meal at a time if I must." He looked at her as though she had lost her senses, and perhaps she had, exhaustion and fear making her bold in ways she would never have dared under ordinary circumstances. But there was something in his eyes now, not warmth exactly, but a flicker of interest he seemed unwilling to admit even to himself. "Very well," he said finally, turning toward the door. "You may stay in the servants' quarters for 1 week. Tomorrow evening, you will cook a meal from whatever remains in my kitchen. If it is inedible, you will leave without argument. If it is merely adequate, you will still leave, because adequate is not worth the trouble of housing a stranger." "And if it is more than adequate?" Alara asked, following him out into the rain-soaked courtyard. The Duke did not answer. He simply gestured toward a side door leading into the house, his expression already closing back into its usual guarded stillness, as though he regretted engaging with her at all. Alara followed him inside, shivering, exhausted, and strangely hopeful for the first time since she had fled her village. The manor's interior matched its exterior, grand bones beneath layers of neglect, dust-coated furniture that had once been fine. Curtains hung heavy and faded over windows that had not been opened in what looked like years. A single hallway lantern flickered weakly, casting long shadows across portraits of Ashcombe ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. An older woman appeared from a side corridor, wrapped in a shawl, her gray hair pulled back tightly. She looked between Alara and the Duke with obvious surprise. "My lord, who is this?" "A guest," the Duke said flatly, already walking away. "For 1 week. Mrs. Whitfield will show you to a room, Alara. Do not wander the east wing." He disappeared down the hallway without another word, leaving Alara standing dripping in the entryway, with the housekeeper studying her with sharp, curious eyes.
"Well," Mrs. Whitfield said after a long pause, "I have not heard the Duke offer shelter to a soul in 3 years."
"You must have said something remarkable. I offered to cook for him," Alara admitted. Mrs. Whitfield's eyebrows rose so high they nearly vanished into her hairline. "Cook for him? Girl, do you have any notion what state that kitchen is in? Nothing has been properly stocked since the last cook left, and that was over a year ago." "Then I will make do with what remains," Alara said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, then finally offered a small, tired smile. "You are either very brave or very foolish, child. Come, let us get you dry and fed before you catch your death." She led Alara down a narrow servants' corridor, past empty rooms and closed doors, finally stopping at a small chamber with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single shuttered window. It was simple, plain, and colder than Alara would have liked, but after the storm outside, it felt like the safest place she had been in weeks. "Rest now," Mrs. Whitfield said. "Tomorrow will be difficult enough without exhaustion weighing you down." Alone in the small room, Alara peeled off her soaked clothing and wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket left folded at the foot of the bed. She sat by the shuttered window, listening to the storm slowly weaken outside, and thought about the strange turn her life had taken in a single night. Hours ago, she had been running for her life through mud and rain. Now she lay in the servants' quarters of a manor owned by a man the whole valley feared, tasked with proving her worth through a single meal. She thought of her mother, who had died when Alara was young, and the small kitchen where she had first learned to cook, watching her mother's hands move with quiet confidence over simple ingredients, turning nothing into something worth savoring. She thought of her father, kind but careless with money, always promising better days that never arrived. She thought of the village that had turned on her so quickly, as though years of living among them had counted for nothing. She would not think of them for long. Tomorrow demanded her full attention, and she intended to meet it fully prepared. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the fading rumble of the storm and the unfamiliar creaks of an old house settling around her. When she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed not of the village she had fled, but of a kitchen filled with warm light, and a table set for two. She woke before dawn, the manor silent around her, and dressed quickly in her still damp clothes, determined to see the kitchen before anyone else stirred. She found her way through the dim corridors by memory of the previous night's path, and when she finally pushed open the heavy kitchen door, she stopped, momentarily stunned by what she saw. Mrs. Whitfield had not exaggerated. The kitchen looked as though it had been abandoned mid-use, coated in dust, cobwebs strung between hanging pots, shelves nearly bare, except for a few jars of preserved fruit, and a small sack of flour gone slightly stale. A single window let in the earliest gray light of morning, illuminating the neglect in unforgiving detail. Ilara pressed her palm against the cold stone counter and took a slow breath. This was not the kitchen of her dreams, warm and stocked with fresh ingredients. This was a challenge, disguised as an impossible task, and she understood clearly now why the Duke had agreed so easily to her offer. He expected her to fail. She would not give him that satisfaction. Rolling up her sleeves, she began searching every corner of the kitchen, every cupboard, every forgotten drawer, determined to find something, anything, she could use to build a meal worth remembering. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a fresh, damp morning, and somewhere beyond the kitchen walls, a garden waited, overgrown but not entirely lost, holding secrets Ilara had not yet discovered. Whatever tomorrow held, she intended to meet it standing, not running, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The manor was silent around her, holding its breath, waiting to see if the stranger in its stables truly intended to make it a home again. She rolled up her sleeves and began to search, refusing to let a single locked door or empty shelf stop her from finding what she needed. The Duke had given her one chance, and she intended to take it with both hands, storm or no storm, curse or no curse, whatever the valley whispered about this house, and the man who ruled it in silence. Morning light crept steadily through the grimy kitchen window, and somewhere above her, in a chamber far grander than her own, the Duke lay awake, staring at his ceiling, wondering why he had allowed a stranger to remain under his roof at all, and wondering, despite himself, what she might actually manage to create from nothing but neglect and a few forgotten jars. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself he expected nothing. He told himself many things that morning, and believed almost none of them. Ilara found the root cellar just past sunrise, a low door hidden behind a curtain of ivy at the back of the kitchen. Inside, the air was cool and earthy, and to her relief, she discovered baskets of onions gone soft at the edges but still usable, a net of wrinkled carrots, a few pale turnips, and a small barrel of salted meat pushed into the far corner, forgotten by whoever had last stocked this room. It was not much, but it was enough to build something honest. She carried her findings back to the kitchen and laid them out across the stone counter, studying them the way a painter studies empty canvas. Her mother had taught her that a good stew was not about having the finest ingredients, but about understanding how humble things could support each other, how patience could turn plain roots and tired meat into something that tasted like comfort. Ilara intended to prove that lesson true today, in a kitchen that had clearly forgotten what comfort even meant. She lit the old hearth fire first, coaxing flame from damp kindling with the same stubbornness she had used to survive the storm the night before. Smoke curled up the chimney, and slowly warmth began to fill the cold room, chasing away some of the gloom that clung to every surface. While the fire grew steady, she returned to the garden behind the kitchen, the one she had glimpsed from the window earlier that morning. It was wild and overgrown, choked with weeds, but beneath the neglect, she spotted herbs that had survived despite years of abandonment. Rosemary, grown into a thick, unruly bush, thyme creeping along the stone path, and a few stalks of parsley stubbornly pushing through cracked soil. She gathered what she could, careful not to take more than she needed, mindful that this garden, however wild, still belonged to someone else. Back inside, Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in her morning shawl, watching Ilara work with an expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. "You have been awake since before the rooster, I see." "I did not want to waste a single hour," Ilara said, chopping onions with quick, practiced strokes. "The Duke expects me to fail. I intend to prove him wrong." "Many have tried to please him," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly. settling onto a stool near the hearth. None have succeeded. Then perhaps none of them understood what he truly needed, Elara replied, though she could not yet say what she meant by that herself. It was simply a feeling, a quiet certainty, that had settled over her the moment she saw the Duke's tired eyes in the stable doorway, eyes that carried more grief than anger, despite how sharply he spoke. Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment before speaking again. You should know something about this house, girl, before you go believing a warm meal can undo years of sorrow. Elara paused her chopping, giving the older woman her full attention. The Duke was not always like this, Mrs. Whitfield continued. 3 years ago, this manor was full of laughter. His wife, Lady Miriam, filled every room with warmth. She loved this garden you gathered your herbs from. She used to say a house without good food in its kitchen was a house without a soul. What happened to her? Elara asked gently. A fever took her, sudden and cruel. In the same season the harvest failed. The Duke shut himself away after her passing, dismissed most of the staff, and has not allowed joy back into these halls since. Some in the valley say he blames himself for not calling for a physician sooner. Others say grief simply broke something in him that has never mended. Elara looked down at the vegetables in front of her, understanding now why the kitchen had been left to decay, why the whole house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for permission to live again. Then perhaps this stew is not just a test, she murmured. Perhaps it is a door, if he is willing to walk through it. Mrs. Whitfield's expression softened slightly. Do not expect too much, child. Grief like his does not vanish over a single meal. I do not expect it to vanish, Elara said. I only hope to remind him that warmth still exists, even in this house. She spent the rest of the morning preparing the stew slowly, layering flavors the way her mother had taught her, browning the salted meat first to draw out its richness, then softening the onions until they turned golden and sweet, adding the carrots and turnips only once the base had deepened into something fragrant and full. She crushed the rosemary between her fingers before adding it, releasing its sharp, earthy scent into the simmering pot, and finished with a scattering of fresh thyme just before the final hour of slow cooking. While the stew simmered, filling the kitchen with an aroma that seemed to seep into the very stones of the house, Elara used the remaining hours to make herself useful elsewhere. She swept the front hallway, careful not to disturb the portraits watching from the walls, and dusted the long dining table that looked as though it had not been properly used in years. She found a single unbroken vase in a forgotten cupboard and filled it with wildflowers from the edge of the garden, setting it in the center of the table, a small defiant splash of color against so much faded gray. By late afternoon, the entire ground floor of the manor smelled different, warmer, richer, as though the house itself had begun to remember what it once was. Servants who remained, only a handful of loyal souls who had stayed through years of neglect out of duty rather than wages, began peering curiously into the kitchen, drawn by a scent none of them had smelled within these walls for a long time. The Duke did not emerge from his study until the sun had begun its slow descent toward the hills, staining the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. Elara heard his footsteps in the hallway before she saw him, heavy and deliberate, the footsteps of a man walking toward something he had already decided would disappoint him. He appeared in the dining room doorway, dressed simply, his expression guarded as always, though his eyes flicked briefly toward the vase of wildflowers on the table, before returning to Elara with obvious suspicion. You have been busy, he said, his tone carefully neutral. I promised you a meal worth remembering, Elara replied, setting a single bowl before him at the head of the long table. I intend to keep that promise. He sat slowly, studying the bowl in front of him, as though it might contain some trick rather than simple stew. Steam rose gently from the surface, carrying the scent of rosemary and slow-cooked meat, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face, an expression Elara could not quite name, gone before she could study it further. You expect a bowl of root vegetables and salted meat to impress a man who has dined at the finest tables in the kingdom, he said, lifting his spoon with obvious reluctance. I expect nothing, Elara said honestly. I only hope you will taste it before you decide what to think of it. He hesitated, spoon hovering above the bowl, and for a moment, Elara feared he would refuse entirely, would push the bowl aside and declare their arrangement finished before it had truly begun. But then, slowly, he brought the spoon to his lips. Silence stretched through the dining room. broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire Alara had lit earlier, and the soft rustle of wind against the shuttered windows. The Duke did not speak. He simply sat, spoon lowered, staring down at the bowl with an expression Alara had not seen on him before. Something raw and unguarded. Something that looked almost like pain. "My lord?" Alara asked carefully, uncertain whether his silence meant failure or something else entirely. He did not answer immediately. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes carried a depth of emotion that startled her, though his voice, when he finally spoke, remained carefully controlled. "My mother," Alara said softly. "She taught me everything I know about turning simple things into something worth sharing." The Duke looked back down at the bowl, his jaw tightening slightly. "My wife used to make something very close to this. Rosemary, always too much rosemary. She used to say a good stew should smell like it means business." Alara said nothing, sensing that this moment belonged to him alone, a memory surfacing unexpectedly, uninvited, and undeniably painful. "I have not eaten a meal in this house that tasted like anything other than obligation in 3 years," the Duke said quietly, almost to himself. "Every cook I hired prepared food that filled my stomach, and nothing else. This tastes like something I had convinced myself I would never taste again." He lifted another spoonful, slower this time, savoring it rather than testing it, and Alara watched something shift behind his eyes. Some wall she had not even known existed beginning, just slightly, to crack. "I believe," he said finally, setting down his spoon and looking directly at her, "that our agreement requires reconsideration." Alara held her breath, uncertain what direction his words would take. "1 week," he said. "You proposed 1 week, and I believe I offered you a single test before dismissal. But I find myself unwilling to end this arrangement so quickly, given the evidence in front of me." "Does that mean I may stay longer, my lord?" Alara asked carefully. "It means," the Duke said, a ghost of something almost like humor touching the corner of his mouth, though his eyes remained heavy with old grief, "that you may remain until I decide otherwise. Do not mistake this for warmth, Alara. I remain a difficult man to please." "I did not expect otherwise," Alara said, unable to fully suppress the small smile forming on her own lips. "But I intend to keep trying, whether you make it easy or not." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his tired eyes, before finally rising from the table, leaving half the stew unfinished, though Alara noticed he carried the bowl with him, rather than leaving it behind for the servants to clear. That night, as she lay once again in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Alara allowed herself a small measure of hope, fragile but real, that perhaps she had found more than mere shelter within these cold stone walls. Perhaps, if she was patient enough, she truly could turn this house of silence and sorrow into something resembling a home once more. Outside her shuttered window, the storm clouds had fully cleared, leaving behind a sky scattered with quiet stars, indifferent witnesses to the small, fragile beginning taking root inside Ashcombe Manor. Word of the stranger cooking for the Duke spread quickly through the small staff that remained at Ashcombe Manor, and by the following morning, Alara found herself the subject of quiet curiosity wherever she walked. A young stable boy named Tobias, no older than 14, appeared at the kitchen door not long after sunrise, peering in with wide, hopeful eyes. "Is it true you made the Duke finish an entire bowl last night?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, as though trying to appear casual, despite his obvious excitement. "He finished most of it," Alara said, smiling as she stirred a pot of porridge for the staff's breakfast, "though I suspect he would deny enjoying it if anyone asked him directly." "He has not eaten more than a few bites of anything in months," Tobias said, stepping further into the kitchen. "Mrs. Whitfield worries about him, though she would never say so where he might hear." "Does he not eat properly?" Alara asked, concerned despite herself. "He eats enough to survive," Tobias said with a shrug that seemed far too practiced for someone so young. "But not enough to seem alive." The words settled heavily in Alara's chest, and she found herself thinking of the Duke's expression the previous night, the raw vulnerability that had flickered across his face before he quickly hid it away again. She resolved, quietly, that she would not simply cook meals to satisfy hunger. She would cook meals meant to remind him what it felt like to want to keep living. Over the following days, Alara settled into a rhythm within the manor's quiet routines. She rose before dawn each morning, tending first to the kitchen garden, pulling weeds and coaxing new growth from soil that had been neglected for far too long. Mrs. Whitfield, initially skeptical of the stranger who had appeared during a storm, gradually warmed to her, offering small pieces of advice about the household's habits and quirks, information that helped Alara navigate the manor's unspoken rules. "The Duke prefers silence in the mornings," Mrs. Whitfield told her one afternoon while they folded linens together in the small laundry room. "He takes his coffee alone in the study, and heaven help the servant who disturbs him before he has finished his first cup." "And in the evenings?" Alara asked. "In the evenings, he used to walk the gardens with Lady Miriam," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice softening with memory. "Now he simply sits in his study until the candles burn low, staring at nothing in particular, or so I have heard from those who dare peek through the door." Alara filed away every piece of information Mrs. Whitfield offered, slowly building a picture of the man she had agreed to cook for, a picture far more complicated than the cold, unfeeling Duke the villagers had warned her about. She began to understand that his sharpness was not cruelty, but armor, built carefully over years to protect a wound that had never properly healed. She also grew close to a young maid named Bridget, who had remained at the manor, out of loyalty to Lady Miriam's memory, rather than any particular fondness for the Duke himself. Bridget suffered from a persistent cough that seemed to worsen with the damp weather, and Alara, remembering remedies her mother had once taught her, began preparing warm broths infused with ginger and honey to ease the girl's discomfort. "You did not need to trouble yourself over me," Bridget said one evening, cradling a steaming cup between her thin fingers, her cheeks flushed with gratitude rather than fever for once. "It was no trouble," Alara said simply. "A house cannot become a home if the people within it are left to suffer quietly." Bridget looked at her with an expression of quiet wonder. "You speak as though you truly believe this house can become something more than what it is now." "I believe every house holds the possibility of becoming a home," Alara said. "It simply requires someone willing to tend to it, the way one tends to a garden left too long without care." Word of Alara's kindness spread among the remaining staff, and slowly, the atmosphere within Ashcombe Manor began to shift, subtly, but unmistakably. Servants who had once moved through the halls in careful, muted silence began exchanging small smiles, quiet conversations, moments of warmth that had long been absent from these cold stone corridors. The Duke, however, remained a more difficult figure to reach. Though he continued to eat the meals Alara prepared each evening, he offered little in the way of conversation or acknowledgement, retreating quickly to his study once his plate was cleared. Alara did not push him, understanding instinctively that trust, once broken as deeply as his had been, could not be rebuilt through force or impatience. Instead, she focused her efforts on small, quiet gestures, leaving a fresh pot of tea outside his study door each morning, ensuring his favorite herbs, discovered through careful questioning of Mrs. Whitfield, found their way into his evening meals, tending the small section of garden visible from his study window, so that something green and alive greeted his eyes each time he glanced outside. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, Alara found herself lingering in the dining room after clearing away the Duke's dinner plate, drawn by an old portrait hanging above the fireplace that she had not properly examined before. It depicted a woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, dressed in soft green fabric, standing in what Alara recognized as the very garden she had been slowly restoring behind the kitchen. That was my wife. Alara startled, turning to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. She had not heard him return. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," he said, stepping further into the room, his gaze fixed on the portrait rather than on her. "Few people look at that painting anymore. Most avoid this room entirely." "She has kind eyes," Alara said softly, uncertain whether she should speak further on such a delicate subject. "She had a kind heart to match them," the Duke said, his voice quieter than Alara had ever heard it. "Kinder than mine, certainly. She was the one who insisted on keeping that garden, despite my complaints that it required too much upkeep for too little reward." "I have been tending it," Alara admitted. "I hope that does not trouble you." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the portrait above the fireplace. "No," he said finally. "It does not trouble me. I believe she would have approved." Something in his voice, some small crack in the careful control he maintained, told Alara that this conversation, however brief, marked a shift between them, a moment of trust extended, however cautiously, from a man who had clearly forgotten how to offer it. "May I ask you something, my lord?" Alara said carefully. He turned to look at her then, his expression guarded once more, though not entirely closed. "You may ask. I make no promise of an answer. Why did you agree to let me stay, that first night in the stable? You could have sent me away without a second thought." The Duke considered her question for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly back to the portrait before returning to her. "Because you reminded me of someone who once believed, quite stubbornly, that even the coldest houses could be warmed with enough patience and good food." Alara felt something tighten in her chest at his words, understanding now the true weight of what she had unknowingly stepped into. Not merely a test of her cooking, but an echo of a grief the Duke had carried silently for years, a grief he had perhaps hoped, in some small and unspoken way, that she might help ease. "I did not know your wife," she said gently, "but I hope, in whatever small way I can, to honor what she began in this house." The Duke did not respond immediately. He simply studied her for a long moment, his expression softening in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar to his own face, before finally turning and walking toward the door. "Good night, Alara," he said quietly, pausing briefly in the doorway. "The stew tonight was excellent, as it has been every night this week." It was the closest thing to genuine praise he had offered since her arrival, and long after he disappeared down the darkened hallway, Alara remained standing before the portrait of Lady Miriam, feeling, for the first time since fleeing her village in the storm, that she had found not just shelter, but purpose within these quiet, grieving walls. Autumn settled over Ashcombe Manor with a gentleness that surprised everyone who lived within its walls, as though the season itself sensed the slow thaw taking place inside the old stone house. Alara had now been at the manor for nearly a month, and the transformation, though gradual, had become impossible for anyone to ignore. The kitchen garden, once a tangle of weeds and forgotten herbs, now grew in careful rows. Thanks to hours of patient work, Alara poured into it each morning, before the sun had fully risen. Pumpkins swelled orange and heavy along one fence line, and late beans climbed wooden stakes she had fashioned from broken fence posts, found discarded near the stables. The garden had become something of a gathering place for the staff, who found excuses to linger near its edges during their brief moments of rest, drawn by the simple pleasure of watching something grow after years of watching everything around them decay. Tobias, the stable boy, had appointed himself Alara's unofficial assistant, following her between the garden and kitchen with an eagerness that reminded her of a puppy trailing after its favorite person. He asked endless questions about cooking, about the herbs she planted, about her life before arriving at the manor, and Alara found herself answering more openly than she had expected, comforted by his innocent curiosity. "Did you always know how to cook?" Tobias asked one afternoon, helping her carry a basket of freshly picked carrots into the kitchen. "My mother taught me," Alara said, setting the basket down near the washing basin. "She used to say that cooking was simply another way of showing someone you cared, without needing to say the words aloud." "The Duke does not say much of anything aloud," Tobias observed, wrinkling his nose thoughtfully. "Maybe that is why he likes your cooking so much. It says things he cannot." Alara smiled at the boy's unexpected wisdom, though she said nothing in response, unwilling to examine too closely the warmth that had begun to settle in her chest whenever she thought of the Duke's quiet, guarded gratitude. Their evenings had developed a rhythm of their own over the past weeks. The Duke still retreated to his study after dinner most nights, but he had begun lingering at the table slightly longer, occasionally offering brief comments about the meal, or asking quiet questions about her life before Ashcombe Manor. Alara treasured these small conversations, understanding that each one represented a crack in the careful walls he had built around himself. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the dining room windows, the Duke surprised her by remaining at the table long after his plate had been cleared, watching as she gathered dishes to carry back toward the kitchen. "You have done more for this house in a single month than most managed in years," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the small vase of late wildflowers she had placed at the center of the table, a habit she had continued since her very first evening. "The house had simply been waiting for someone to notice it still had potential," Alara replied, setting down the dishes she carried to give him her full attention. "Or perhaps," the Duke said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar softness, "it had been waiting for someone stubborn enough to refuse giving up on it, despite every reason to do so. Alara felt her cheeks warm slightly under his gaze, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected observation. "I am not entirely certain those are different things, my lord." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, though Alara had come to recognize these small flickers of warmth as significant victories, hard-won against years of carefully maintained grief. "Tell me something about your mother," he said suddenly, surprising her further. "The one who taught you to cook." Alara hesitated, unaccustomed to the Duke expressing interest in her life beyond her usefulness within his household. But something in his expression, an openness she had not seen from him before, encouraged her to continue. "She died when I was 12, Alara said softly, settling into the chair across from him despite the impropriety of a servant sitting at her employer's table uninvited. "A fever took her, much like your own wife, though ours was a smaller house, with far less grandeur to lose." "Grief does not measure itself by the size of the house it visits," the Duke said quietly. "No," Alara agreed. "I suppose it does not." "What do you remember most about her?" he asked, leaning forward slightly, his usual guarded posture softening into something more genuinely curious. Alara considered the question carefully before answering. "Her hands," she said finally. "She had strong hands, always moving, always working. Whether kneading bread or braiding my hair before bed. I remember thinking, as a child, that her hands could fix anything, could turn any bad day into something bearable, simply through the act of preparing a meal together." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, almost distant, as though her words had stirred memories of his own. "Miriam's hands were always covered in dirt from that garden," he said finally. "I used to tease her about it, tell her a duchess should not have soil beneath her fingernails. She would simply laugh and tell me that clean hands accomplished very little of lasting value." "She sounds like she understood something important," Alara said gently. "She understood many things I have only recently begun to understand myself," the Duke admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the crackling hearth fire the only sound in the room, before the Duke finally rose from his seat, his expression once again settling into its familiar guarded lines, though something in his eyes remained softer than before. "Thank you, Alara," he said quietly, "for the meal, and for the conversation." "You are welcome, my lord," she replied, watching him leave the room with a lightness she had not noticed in his steps before. Later that night, as Alara prepared for bed in her small chamber, Bridget appeared at her door, her expression carrying a mixture of excitement and hesitation. "Mrs. Whitfield says you should know something," Bridget said, stepping inside and closing the door quietly behind her. "What is it?" Alara asked, concerned by the maid's serious tone. "The Duke has requested that a new cook not be hired to replace the position you currently hold," Bridget said. "He told Mrs. Whitfield this afternoon that your arrangement should continue indefinitely, so long as you wish to remain." Alara felt her breath catch slightly at the news, understanding the significance of such a decision from a man who had dismissed every previous attempt to fill his kitchen with warmth and comfort. Did he say why? "Mrs. Whitfield believes he simply could not imagine returning to meals prepared by anyone else," Bridget said, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Though I suspect there may be more to it than mere appetite." Alara said nothing in response, though her heart beat a little faster at the implication carried within Bridget's words. She thought of the Duke's softened expression as he spoke of his late wife, of the quiet warmth that had begun to grow between them over the shared table each evening, and wondered, for the first time, whether the home she had promised to build within these walls might eventually include a place for herself as well, not merely as a cook, but as something more. She pushed the thought aside quickly, reminding herself of the vast difference between a duke and a penniless girl who had arrived at his gates with nothing but bare feet and desperate hope. Whatever warmth had begun growing between them, she told herself, was likely nothing more than gratitude, the natural response of a grieving man, finally remembering what comfort tasted like after years of self-imposed isolation. Yet as she settled into her narrow bed that night, staring up at the shadowed ceiling above her, she could not entirely convince herself that gratitude alone explained the way her heart had quickened at his words, or the way his eyes had lingered on her throughout their quiet conversation at the table. Outside her window, The autumn wind continued its steady rustle through the newly restored garden, carrying with it the earthy scent of turned soil and late harvest, a scent that had, in just one short month, become as familiar to Ashcombe Manor as the very stones that formed its ancient walls. The garden had become Alara's quiet sanctuary, a place where she could think without the weight of watching eyes or careful words. On a cool morning in late autumn, she knelt among the rows of late vegetables, her hands buried in soil, still damp from the previous night's frost, when she noticed the study window above her had been left slightly open, and through it drifted a sound she had never heard within these walls before, the soft, halting notes of a piano. She paused, listening, her hands still in the dirt, as the melody continued, uncertain and rusty, as though the fingers playing it had not touched the keys in a very long time. She recognized, with a small jolt of surprise, that the music belonged to the Duke himself. She did not mention what she had heard when she brought his afternoon tea to the study door later that day, though she noticed the piano bench pushed slightly away from the wall, and a thin layer of dust disturbed across the keys of an instrument that had clearly sat untouched for years before that morning. "You are staring at my piano," the Duke observed, not looking up from the papers scattered across his desk. "Forgive me," Alara said quickly, setting down the tea tray. "I did not know you played." "I do not play," he corrected, though his tone lacked its usual sharpness. "I used to play. There is a difference." "The music I heard this morning sounded like playing to me," Alara said gently. The Duke finally looked up, his expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and something softer, something almost vulnerable. "Miriam used to insist I practice every evening after dinner. She said a man who could not make music with his hands had not truly learned patience. Perhaps she would be pleased to know you have returned to it, even after all this time," Ilara offered. "Perhaps," he said quietly, though his gaze drifted toward the window, toward the garden Ilara had spent weeks restoring beneath it. "I find myself remembering many things I had convinced myself I had forgotten entirely." Their conversations had grown gradually more frequent over the following weeks, no longer confined solely to the dinner table, but scattered throughout the day in small, unplanned moments. A shared observation about the weather while crossing paths in the hallway, a brief discussion about a book left open on the study desk, questions about the garden's progress asked with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. The staff had noticed the shift as well, exchanging quiet, hopeful glances whenever the Duke's laughter, still rare but no longer entirely absent, echoed faintly through the manor's halls. Mrs. Whitfield, in particular, seemed to regard Ilara with a growing warmth that bordered on maternal affection, often finding excuses to work alongside her in the kitchen, simply to share in the easy companionship that had grown between them. "You have done something none of us thought possible," Mrs. Whitfield said one afternoon, watching Ilara prepare a simple soup for the evening meal. "I have worked in this house for over 20 years, child. I watched the Duke grow from a laughing young man into someone who forgot how to smile entirely. You have brought something back that I feared was lost forever." "I have only cooked a few meals and tended a garden," Ilara said modestly, though warmth spread through her chest at the housekeeper's words. "You have done far more than that, and you know it," Mrs. Whitfield said, her eyes knowing. "Be careful, Ilara. A heart mended too quickly can sometimes forget its own boundaries." Ilara understood the older woman's gentle warning, recognizing the growing affection she felt toward the Duke, an affection that had crept upon her slowly, disguised at first as simple sympathy, then gradually deepening into something far more complicated. She reminded herself often of the vast distance between their stations, the impossibility of a penniless cook harboring feelings for a Duke, however kind his eyes had grown when they rested on her. Yet despite her careful reminders, she found herself looking forward to their shared moments with an eagerness she could not entirely suppress, treasuring each small conversation, each rare smile, each quiet acknowledgement of the connection growing steadily between them. One evening, as she walked through the restored garden after finishing her kitchen duties, enjoying the last golden light of the setting sun, she found the Duke standing near the fence line, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the neat rows of vegetables with quiet contemplation. "I did not expect to find you here, my lord," she said, approaching slowly. "I find myself drawn to this garden more frequently than I once was," he admitted, not turning to look at her immediately. "It reminds me of things I thought I had lost permanently. I hope those memories bring you comfort rather than pain." Ilara said softly. He finally turned to face her, his expression carrying a complexity she had grown accustomed to reading over the past weeks. Grief still present, but softened now by something warmer, something that looked increasingly like hope. Both, I think, he said honestly. Though I have come to believe the comfort now outweighs the pain, which I did not think possible even a few months ago. Change often arrives slowly, Ilara said, until suddenly it does not. You speak as though you understand this from experience, the Duke observed. I fled my village with nothing but bare feet and desperate hope, Ilara reminded him. I did not expect, even a few weeks ago, to find myself standing in a garden I helped restore, speaking with a Duke as though we were simply two people, sharing a quiet evening. Something shifted in his expression at her words, a warmth that seemed almost startled by its own existence. Is that troubling to you, Ilara? Speaking with me as though we were simply two people? No, she said honestly, her heart beating a little faster beneath his steady gaze. I find I have grown rather fond of these quiet moments, my lord. Alistair, he said suddenly, surprising her. My lord? She asked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. My name, he clarified, a faint smile touching his lips. I would like you to use it when we are simply two people sharing a quiet evening. Ilara felt warmth spread through her chest at the small, significant gesture, understanding the weight behind such an offer, from a man who had spent years hiding behind careful titles and guarded distance. Alistair, she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. I find I rather like the way you say it, he admitted, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen before. They stood together in comfortable silence, as the last light of evening faded into twilight, the garden around them settling into shadow, though neither seemed eager to end the moment, or retreat back into the more formal roles they usually occupied. Something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable, a recognition of feelings neither had fully voiced, yet both understood existed nonetheless. I should return to the kitchen, Ilara said eventually, though reluctance colored her voice. Of course, Alistair said, though he too seemed unwilling to end their conversation. Thank you, Ilara, for this evening. Thank you, Alistair, she replied, testing his name once more, warmth blooming further in her chest at the easy familiarity now existing between them. As she walked back toward the kitchen, her heart light despite the uncertainty of what such growing closeness might eventually mean for two people separated by such vast differences in station, Ilara allowed herself, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, to hope for something beyond mere survival, something that felt dangerously, wonderfully close to happiness. Behind her, in the deepening shadows of the restored garden, Alistair remained standing for a long while, watching her retreating figure with an expression that, had anyone been present to witness it, would have revealed far more than he had ever intended to show. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the hills surrounding Ashcombe Manor with a fine layer of frost that clung stubbornly to every branch and rooftop. Despite the falling temperatures, the manor itself had never felt warmer, filled now with the sounds of servants humming quietly while they worked, the occasional burst of laughter echoing down previously silent corridors, and the ever-present aroma of Ilara's cooking drifting from the kitchen into every corner of the house. Ilara had spent the past several weeks preserving what remained of the autumn harvest, filling the root cellar with jars of pickled vegetables, strings of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and barrels of salted meat prepared to last through the coming cold months. She took pride in this work, understanding that a well-stocked pantry meant a house that could weather hardship without falling back into the neglect she had first discovered upon her arrival. Tobias had grown taller over the months, or so it seemed to Ilara, though perhaps it was simply that he carried himself with newfound confidence, no longer the timid boy who had first peered curiously into the kitchen doorway. He had become skilled at identifying which herbs were ready for harvest and which needed more time, a small but meaningful responsibility that filled him with obvious pride whenever Alistair, passing through the garden, offered a rare word of approval for his work. Bridget's health had improved steadily as well, her persistent cough finally clearing after weeks of warm broths and careful rest, and she had taken to assisting Ilara in the kitchen during the quieter hours of the afternoon, learning simple recipes with an eagerness that reminded Ilara pleasantly of her own early lessons at her mother's side. The relationship between Ilara and Alistair had continued its slow, careful bloom throughout these winter weeks, though neither had yet spoken openly of the feelings clearly growing between them. Their evenings together had become a cherished ritual, dinner followed by quiet conversation, sometimes in the dining room, sometimes in the study, where Alistair had taken to practicing piano, with growing confidence, the melodies no longer halting and uncertain, but flowing with a warmth that mirrored the changes taking place within the house itself. One particularly cold evening, as snow began falling steadily outside the study windows, Alistair looked up from the piano keys to find Alara watching him from the doorway, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the winter chill. "You have been practicing," she observed, stepping into the room. "I have had excellent motivation," he replied, a smile touching his lips as he gestured for her to join him on the piano bench. She hesitated only briefly before crossing the room and settling beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool evening air. "Play something for me," she said softly. Alistair's fingers found the keys once more, and this time, the melody that emerged was slower, more deliberate, carrying within it an emotion Alara could not quite name, though it settled warmly in her chest as she listened. When the final notes faded into silence, he turned to look at her, his expression open and unguarded, in a way she had rarely witnessed. "Miriam taught me that piece," he said quietly. "I have not been able to play it since her passing, until tonight." "What changed?" Alara asked gently. "You did," he said simply, his gaze steady on hers. "You arrived at my gates during a storm, offering nothing but stubborn hope, and a promise to make this house a home again. I did not believe you, not truly, not that first night, but somehow, without my fully realizing it, you have done exactly what you promised." Alara felt her breath catch at the sincerity in his words, understanding the significance of such an admission from a man who had spent years guarding himself against precisely this kind of vulnerability. "I only wish to earn my place within these walls," she said softly. "I did not expect to find something so much greater than mere shelter." "And what have you found?" Alistair asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching hers with a question neither had yet dared voice openly. "I have found purpose," Alara said carefully, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. "I have found friendship among the staff, warmth within these walls that I did not expect to discover. And I have found—" She paused, uncertain whether to continue, before finally deciding that honesty, however frightening, was owed to this moment they had built together over so many careful weeks. I have found feelings for you, Alistair, that I did not expect and do not entirely know how to navigate, given the differences between our stations." Alistair's expression softened further at her admission, relief and warmth mingling openly across his features. "I have felt similarly for weeks now," he confessed, "though I convinced myself such feelings were inappropriate, given everything you have already sacrificed simply to find safety within these walls. I did not wish to burden you further with expectations you had not sought." "You have not burdened me," Alara said softly, reaching to gently touch his hand where it rested on the piano keys. "You have given me something I did not know I still needed, a reason to believe that warmth and belonging remain possible, even after everything I lost." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the falling snow outside casting soft shadows across the study walls, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, filling the room with a warmth that mirrored the quiet understanding now settled between them. "I do not wish to rush whatever this is between us," Alistair said finally, his thumb gently tracing small circles against her hand. "But I also do not wish to spend another day pretending I do not feel what I clearly feel for you, Alara." "Then let us not pretend," Alara said, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. "Let us simply allow this to grow as naturally as the garden we have tended together these past months." Alistair's answering smile carried a warmth Alara had never before witnessed from him, a genuine, unguarded happiness that transformed his features entirely, stripping away years of careful sorrow to reveal the man Mrs. Whitfield had once described, laughing and full of life, before grief had claimed him so completely. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door, and Mrs. Whitfield appeared, her expression carrying obvious concern despite her attempt to remain composed.
"My lord, forgive the interruption, but a rider has just arrived with urgent news."
"Baron Colton Vane requests an audience with you at your earliest convenience regarding matters concerning the estate's boundaries." Alistair's expression shifted immediately, the warmth of moments before, replaced by a familiar wariness that Alara had witnessed only rarely since her arrival. "Baron Vane," he repeated, his voice carrying a tension she had not heard in weeks. "You know this man?" Alara asked, concerned by the sudden change in his demeanor. "I know him well," Alistair said grimly, rising from the piano bench. "He has long sought to claim portions of Ashcombe land through legal maneuvering, taking advantage of the years I spent too consumed by grief to properly manage this estate's affairs. His timing suggests he has learned of the changes taking place within these walls and intends to exploit whatever weakness he believes remains." Alara felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside, sensing that the fragile peace they had built together over these past months faced its first true test. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will face him," Alistair said, his expression hardening with a determination Alara had not witnessed before. "As I should have faced many things these past years, rather than hiding behind grief and isolation. This house has become something worth protecting again, Alara, and I do not intend to lose it, or the people within it, to a man motivated purely by greed." Mrs. Whitfield nodded approvingly at his words before retreating to prepare guest quarters for the impending arrival, leaving Alara and Alistair standing together in the study, the warmth of their earlier conversation now shadowed by the uncertainty of what challenges awaited them both in the coming days. "Whatever happens," Alara said softly, reaching once more for his hand, "know that I intend to stand beside you through it, Alistair, just as I promised that first stormy night at your gates." Alistair squeezed her hand gently, his expression carrying gratitude mixed with quiet determination. "Then perhaps, with you beside me, I finally stand a chance against whatever storm Baron Vane intends to bring upon this house." Outside, the snow continued falling steadily, blanketing Ashcombe Manor in quiet white stillness, unaware of the challenges approaching that would test not only the fragile happiness Alara and Alistair had built together, but the very future of the home they had worked so carefully to restore. Baron Colton Vane arrived at Ashcombe Manor 3 days later, his carriage pulling through the gates with an air of practiced confidence that Alara found immediately unsettling. He was a tall man, sharply dressed in fine wool, his smile polished in a way that never quite reached his calculating eyes. He greeted Alistair with exaggerated warmth, though Alara noticed how carefully he studied the restored garden, the freshly swept hallways, the general air of renewed life within the manor, as though searching for weaknesses rather than admiring genuine improvement. "Ashcombe," Vane said smoothly, clasping Alistair's hand with a grip that lingered a moment too long. "I must say, the estate looks remarkably improved since my last visit. I had heard rumors of neglect, yet everything before me suggests quite the opposite." "The estate has received proper attention in recent months," Alistair replied evenly, though Alara, standing slightly behind him near the entrance hall, recognized the careful control in his voice, the same guarded tension she had witnessed the evening the news first arrived. "How fortunate," Vane said, his gaze shifting deliberately toward Alara, studying her with an appraising look that made her skin crawl slightly. "And who might this be? Surely not merely kitchen staff, given the fine quality of her company at your side." "Alara oversees the household," Alistair said firmly, his tone leaving no room for further inquiry. "Now, Baron Vane, perhaps we should discuss the matter that brought you here, rather than dwelling on domestic arrangements that need not concern you." Vane's smile sharpened slightly at the dismissal, though he did not press the matter further, instead following Alistair toward the study, where the two men disappeared behind closed doors for what would become a lengthy and tense discussion. Alara busied herself in the kitchen throughout the afternoon, preparing a formal dinner meant to demonstrate the manor's restored hospitality, though her mind remained fixed on the closed study door and whatever difficult negotiations were taking place behind it. Mrs. Whitfield joined her partway through the preparations, her expression carrying obvious worry. "Baron Vane has long coveted the northern boundary of Ashcombe land," Mrs. Whitfield explained quietly, helping Alara arrange a platter of roasted vegetables. "He claims an old document exists proving his family's original ownership of that territory, though the Duke has always maintained such claims are fabricated." "Does the Duke have proof to counter such claims?" Alara asked, concern deepening within her. "He did, once," Mrs. Whitfield said grimly. "But in the years following Lady Miriam's passing, when the Duke withdrew entirely from managing the estate's affairs. Many important documents were misplaced, or lost entirely amid the general neglect. I fear Baron Vane may have chosen this moment specifically, because he believes the Duke remains vulnerable, both financially and emotionally. Alara's hands stilled over the platter she had been arranging, a fierce protectiveness rising within her chest, at the thought of this calculating man, attempting to exploit Alistair's past grief for personal gain. Then we must help him find whatever proof remains, she said firmly. This house has fought too hard to reclaim itself to lose any part of it now. Dinner that evening proved a tense affair, Baron Vane maintaining his polished charm throughout the meal while subtly probing for information about the estate's financial standing, his questions carefully disguised as polite conversation, though clearly calculated to expose weaknesses he might later exploit. Alistair answered each inquiry with careful precision, revealing nothing beyond what courtesy required, though Alara could see the strain building visibly behind his composed exterior. "This stew is remarkably good," Vane commented at one point, studying Alara with renewed interest as she refilled his wineglass. "Quite unusual for household staff to prepare something of such quality. Wherever did you learn such skills?" "From my mother, my lord," Alara replied simply, refusing to offer further detail that might give this calculating man any additional leverage over the household he clearly wished to undermine. "How charming," Vane said, though his tone carried a subtle mockery that made Alara's jaw tighten slightly. "It is refreshing to see the Duke has found comfort in such simple pleasures, given the considerable troubles he has faced these past years." "The Duke's personal affairs remain his own concern," Alistair interjected sharply, his patience clearly wearing thin beneath Vane's carefully needling comments. "Perhaps we should conclude this evening's discussion and continue our negotiations tomorrow morning, when both parties are properly rested." Vane inclined his head in agreement, though his expression carried a satisfaction that suggested he believed he had already gained valuable insight into the household's vulnerabilities during the course of the evening's careful conversation. Once Vane had retired to his guest quarters for the night, Alistair found Alara in the kitchen, his expression heavy with the weight of the day's difficult negotiations. "He intends to claim the northern boundary through a supposed ancestral document," he said without preamble, sinking wearily into a chair near the hearth. "I have no counterproof readily available, given the state of my records these past years." "Then we shall search for it together," Alara said firmly, setting aside the dishes she had been washing, to give him her full attention. "This house survived years of neglect and still found its way back to warmth and purpose. I refuse to believe a single missing document will undo everything we have worked to rebuild." Alistair looked up at her, gratitude and exhaustion mingling in his tired eyes. "I do not deserve such unwavering faith, Alara, particularly given how carelessly I allowed this estate's affairs to fall into disarray during my years of grief." "Grief does not make you undeserving of faith," Alara said gently, kneeling beside his chair to meet his gaze directly. "It makes you human, Alistair. And humans, even dukes, are permitted to stumble before finding their footing once more." He reached out, gently cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch slightly. "I do not know what I would have done these past months without you standing beside me," he admitted quietly. "You will not need to find out," Alara said softly, leaning slightly into his touch. "Whatever Baron Vane intends, we shall face it together, just as we have faced everything else since that first stormy night." They spent the following hours searching through the manor's neglected study, sorting through years of disorganized paperwork stacked haphazardly across shelves and drawers that clearly had not been properly maintained since Lady Miriam's passing. The task proved tedious and frustrating, countless documents proving irrelevant to their search, though neither Alara nor Alistair considered abandoning the effort, driven by a shared determination to protect the home they had worked so carefully to rebuild. Near midnight, as exhaustion began weighing heavily on both of them, Alara's fingers brushed against a leather-bound ledger tucked behind a stack of old correspondence, its cover worn, but its pages still legible despite years of neglect. "Alistair," she called softly, pulling the ledger free and opening it carefully under the dim study lamplight. Alistair crossed the room quickly, peering over her shoulder as she turned through the ledger's pages, revealing detailed records of land boundaries, dating back several generations, meticulously documented in careful handwriting that matched other Ashcombe family records they had discovered earlier that evening. "This is it," Alistair breathed, disbelief and relief mingling in his voice as he studied the pages carefully. My grandfather's original survey of the northern boundary, clearly establishing Ashcombe ownership decades before Baron Vane's family ever laid claim to the territory. Then Baron Vane's claim has no true foundation, Ilara said, excitement rising within her at the discovery. None whatsoever, Alistair confirmed, closing the ledger carefully and holding it against his chest, as though it were the most precious object in the entire manor. Thank you, Ilara. Without your persistence tonight, this document might have remained buried indefinitely, and Vane's fraudulent claim might have succeeded through nothing more than my own neglect. We found it together, Ilara reminded him gently, just as we have rebuilt this house together these past months. Alistair studied her for a long moment, warmth and determination mingling in his expression, before finally speaking with renewed confidence. Tomorrow Baron Vane will discover that Ashcombe Manor, and everyone within it, has grown far too strong to be so easily exploited. Outside the study windows, winter snow continued falling silently across the sleeping estate, unaware of the quiet victory achieved within these walls. A victory built not merely on old documents and legal claims, but on the unwavering partnership growing steadily between a grieving duke and the determined woman who had promised, on a stormy night many months before, to make his house a home once more. Morning arrived crisp and clear, sunlight glinting sharply off the fresh snow blanketing the grounds of Ashcombe Manor, as Baron Vane descended the staircase expecting to finalize what he believed would be an easy victory over a grieving duke, too distracted to properly defend his estate. He found Alistair waiting in the study instead, composed and steady, the leather-bound ledger resting prominently on the desk before him, alongside Ilara, who stood quietly but firmly at his side. Ashcombe, Vane greeted, his polished smile faltering slightly at the sight of the ledger, though he quickly recovered his composure. I trust you have reconsidered the reasonable terms I proposed regarding the northern boundary. I have reconsidered nothing, Alistair said calmly, gesturing for Vane to sit across from him. Instead, I have discovered something rather more interesting. He opened the ledger, turning it carefully to display the detailed survey his grandfather had documented decades earlier, watching closely as Vane's expression shifted from confidence to poorly concealed alarm. This is my grandfather's original survey of the northern boundary, Alistair explained, his voice carrying a quiet authority that Ilara had not heard from him before that morning. Clearly dated, clearly witnessed by 3 separate parties whose signatures remain legible to this day. It establishes Ashcombe ownership of that territory, decades before your family's supposed claim ever existed. Vane's composure cracked slightly, though he attempted to maintain his practiced charm. Documents can be misinterpreted, Ashcombe. Surely we can discuss more amenable terms that benefit both our families. There is nothing to discuss, Alistair said firmly. This document proves your claim entirely fraudulent, Baron Vane, and I suspect a closer examination of the paperwork you presented to me yesterday would reveal similar inconsistencies, should I choose to pursue the matter through proper legal channels. Vane's eyes flickered briefly toward Ilara, as though searching for some weakness he might yet exploit. I see the rumors of your household's transformation carry more truth than I initially credited, he said, his tone turning subtly bitter, though I wonder how long such improvements can truly last, given the fragility of grief you have only recently begun overcoming. Ilara felt anger rise sharply within her chest at his thinly veiled insult, though she remained composed, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of visible reaction. Alistair, however, rose from his seat, his expression hardening with a resolve that left no room for further intimidation. My grief, Alistair said, his voice carrying quiet steel, has never been a weakness for you to exploit, Baron Vane, regardless of how it may have appeared these past years. And whatever fragility once existed within this household has been thoroughly replaced by strength, thanks in large part to the woman standing beside me, whose worth you clearly failed to properly recognize. I meant no disrespect, Vane said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. Your intentions matter little at this point, Alistair said coldly. I suggest you withdraw your claim immediately, Baron Vane, before I pursue formal legal action that would expose the fraudulent nature of your paperwork before the entire valley. Such exposure would prove considerably more damaging to your family's reputation than the loss of a boundary dispute you never rightfully possessed. Vane studied Alistair for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing his options before finally offering a stiff, reluctant nod. Very well, Ashcombe. I shall withdraw my claim, given the evidence you have presented, though I suspect this matter shall not be entirely forgotten between our families. I hold no illusions about your continued resentment, Alistair replied evenly, but I trust this concludes our business for today. Vane rose stiffly, his earlier confidence entirely deflated, and made his way toward the study door, pausing briefly to offer one final glance toward Alara, his expression carrying a grudging respect he clearly had not expected to feel. You have chosen your household staff wisely, Ashcombe, he said quietly, before departing without further comment. Once the sound of Vane's carriage had faded down the manor's long drive, Alistair turned to Alara, relief and pride mingling openly across his features. We did it, he said softly, reaching for her hands. You did it, Alara corrected gently, squeezing his hands warmly. I merely helped you find what you needed to defend what was rightfully yours. You have done considerably more than that, Alistair said, his voice growing more serious. You arrived at my gates during a storm, promising to make this house a home again, and I dismissed such promises as the foolish hope of a desperate girl seeking shelter. Yet here we stand, months later, having successfully defended this estate together, having rebuilt not merely its gardens and kitchens, but its very spirit. I only did what felt right, Alara said, warmth spreading through her chest at his heartfelt words. You did far more than what felt right, Alistair continued, stepping closer, his expression carrying an intensity that made Alara's heart race beneath his steady gaze. You reminded me what it means to truly live again, Alara. Rather than merely survive within these grieving walls, you have given me back my music, my garden, my household, and most importantly, my hope for a future I had long since abandoned believing possible. Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved deeply by the sincerity behind his words. I did not expect, when I first stumbled through your gates, to find anything beyond mere shelter from that storm, she admitted softly. Yet here I stand, having found so much more than I ever dared hope for. And what exactly have you found? Alistair asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though the question carried a weight that suggested he already understood the answer, yet needed to hear it spoken aloud regardless. I have found a home, Alara said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion coloring her words. Not merely these walls, though I have grown to love every corner of this manor. I have found a home within the connection we have built together, Alistair, within the warmth and purpose I feel whenever I am near you. Alistair's expression softened entirely at her words, all remaining guardedness melting away to reveal the genuine warmth and affection he had carefully protected for so many years. Then perhaps, he said gently, reaching to brush a stray strand of hair from her face, it is time I properly acknowledge what has grown between us these past months, rather than continuing to tread carefully around feelings we both clearly share. Alara held her breath, anticipation and hope mingling within her chest, as she waited for whatever words Alistair intended to speak next, understanding instinctively that this moment carried significance far beyond their successful defense against Baron Vane's fraudulent claims. Outside the study window, winter sunlight sparkled brightly across the fresh snow, blanketing the restored garden, illuminating the quiet beauty of a home that had, over the course of a single transformative season, learned once more how to hold warmth, hope, and love within its ancient stone walls. News of the successful defense against Baron Vane's fraudulent claim spread quickly through the household staff, and by the following morning, a lightness had settled over Ashcombe Manor that seemed almost tangible in the crisp winter air. Mrs. Whitfield moved through her daily duties with a spring in her step that Alara had not witnessed since her own arrival months earlier, and even the usually reserved kitchen staff exchanged quiet smiles and hopeful glances whenever the subject of the Duke's continued transformation arose in conversation. Alara found herself humming softly while preparing the morning meal, her thoughts still lingering on the tender moment shared with Alistair the previous day, though their conversation had been interrupted before either could fully voice the depth of feeling clearly growing between them. She wondered, with a flutter of nervous anticipation, when he might choose to continue what had been left unspoken. She did not have to wait long. Alistair appeared in the kitchen doorway shortly after breakfast had been served to the staff, his expression carrying a nervous energy that seemed almost boyish, entirely at odds with his usual composed demeanor. "Alara," he said, "might I trouble you to join me in the garden this morning? I find myself in need of your company, and perhaps your opinion on a small matter I have been considering." "Of course," Ilara said, setting aside her morning tasks and following him through the manor's quiet corridors, toward the garden she had spent so many months carefully restoring. The garden looked different beneath its light dusting of winter frost. The vegetable rows dormant now beneath protective layers of straw Ilara had carefully arranged before the season's first hard freeze, though the herb beds near the kitchen door still showed hints of hardy green growth, stubbornly persisting despite the cold. Alistair led her toward the small stone bench positioned beneath the garden's largest oak tree, the very spot, Ilara realized with a soft ache, where the portrait of Lady Miriam had depicted her standing so many years before. "I have been thinking," Alistair began, his usual composure noticeably absent as he clasped and unclasped his hands nervously, "about everything that has changed within these walls since your arrival, Ilara. About the home you promised to build, and the home you have, in fact, built, far exceeding anything I dared hope for that stormy night in my stables." "I only did what felt right," Ilara said softly, echoing her earlier words, though her heart raced with anticipation at whatever Alistair intended to say next. "You have done considerably more than what merely felt right," Alistair continued, stepping closer, his eyes carrying a warmth and vulnerability that stripped away every remaining trace of the guarded, grieving man she had first encountered. "You have taught me that a home is not built from stone and mortar alone, but from warmth, patience, and the quiet courage to keep tending something even when it seems beyond saving. You did this for my house, Ilara, and in doing so, you did it for me as well." Ilara felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, moved deeply by the sincerity radiating from every word he spoke. "Alistair," she began softly, though he gently raised a hand, requesting she allow him to continue. "I do not wish merely to acknowledge what has grown between us," he said, his voice carrying a quiet determination despite its evident nervousness. "I wish to ask something of you, Ilara, something I have not dared consider possible, until these recent months reminded me what true happiness might feel like once more." He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the pale winter sunlight, a delicate ring, simple in design, yet clearly crafted with careful attention, its band adorned with a small cluster of tiny stones that seemed to shimmer softly against the muted winter landscape surrounding them. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," Alistair explained, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Miriam never had the chance to wear it, as it remained locked away during our own courtship, promised instead to whichever future Ashcombe bride might one day complete this family's legacy. I did not believe, for many years, that such a day would ever arrive again." Ilara's breath caught sharply as understanding dawned within her, her heart pounding rapidly beneath her composed exterior. "Ilara," Alistair continued, kneeling slowly before her on the frost-covered garden path, "you arrived at my gates promising to make this house a home, and you have fulfilled that promise beyond anything I could have imagined. But I find myself now wishing for something more than merely a restored home. I wish for a partner to share it with, someone whose warmth and courage have already transformed every corner of my existence. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and completing, in every sense, the home you have already so beautifully built?" Tears spilled freely down Ilara's cheeks as she looked down at the man kneeling before her, a duke who had once been called cold and unfeeling by an entire valley, now offering his heart with a vulnerability and sincerity that left no doubt of the genuine transformation that had taken place within him. "Yes, yes, Alistair, I will marry you." Alistair rose swiftly, gathering her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of the depth of emotion he had carried silently for so many weeks, before gently sliding the delicate ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly with happiness he no longer felt any need to hide. "You have given me back everything I believed lost forever," he murmured against her hair, holding her close beneath the bare branches of the ancient oak tree. "My home, my music, my hope, and now, my heart's deepest happiness." "And you have given me a home I never dared believe I deserved," Ilara replied, her voice thick with emotion, as she leaned back slightly to meet his gaze. "A place where I am valued, not merely for what I can provide, but simply for who I am." They remained together beneath the oak tree for a long while, the winter sun slowly climbing higher above the restored garden, casting warm, golden light across the frost-dusted rows, that Alara had tended so carefully throughout the preceding months. Behind them, unnoticed at first, several members of the household staff had gathered quietly near the kitchen door, having witnessed the entire proposal through the frosted window panes, their expressions filled with genuine joy at the happiness finally returning to Ashcombe Manor after so many years of quiet sorrow. Mrs. Whitfield dabbed gently at her eyes with the corner of her apron, while Tobias grinned so widely his cheeks surely ached from the effort, and Bridget clasped her hands together with delighted excitement, already imagining the celebrations that would soon fill the manor's previously silent halls. As Alara and Alistair finally made their way back toward the house, hand in hand, laughter mingling gently with their quiet conversation, the entire household staff erupted into spontaneous applause, their joy echoing warmly across the winter garden, a fitting celebration for the remarkable transformation that had taken root within these ancient stone walls since the stormy night a determined young woman had first promised to make this house a home. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Manor with a warmth that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within its walls. The garden Alara had so carefully restored, now bursting with new growth, tulips and daffodils lining the very path where Alistair had knelt before her only months earlier, offering a future neither had dared imagine possible during the cold days that first brought them together. The wedding took place in the same garden, decorated simply but beautifully, with fresh spring blooms gathered from the very beds Alara had nursed back to life over the preceding seasons. The entire household staff attended, along with a small gathering of neighbors and distant relations who had heard whispers of the Duke's remarkable transformation and arrived curious to witness for themselves the woman who had accomplished what an entire valley had believed impossible. Mrs. Whitfield stood near the front, tears of genuine happiness streaming freely down her weathered cheeks as she watched the ceremony unfold, while Tobias, dressed in his finest clothes, beamed with pride at having played even a small role in the garden's remarkable restoration. Bridget stood beside several other household maids, all watching with delighted anticipation as Alara made her way down the flower-lined path toward Alistair, who waited beneath the same ancient oak tree where he had first proposed. Alistair's expression, as Alara approached, carried none of the guarded sorrow that had once defined him, replaced entirely by open, unrestrained joy that transformed his features into something Mrs. Whitfield later described as reminiscent of the young man she had known long before grief had claimed him so completely. "You once told me," Alistair said quietly as they stood together before the small gathering, "that you would make this house a home if only I allowed you to remain. I chuckled at your promise then, believing it nothing more than desperate hope from a stranger seeking shelter. And now?" Alara asked softly, her eyes bright with happy tears. "Now," Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion, "I understand that promise carried more truth than either of us could have imagined that stormy night. You did not merely make this house a home, Alara. You gave me back my life, my heart, and now, my future." The ceremony continued with simple, heartfelt vows exchanged beneath the blooming oak tree, the spring sunshine casting warm golden light across the newly restored garden, illuminating rows of vegetables and herbs that Alara had tended with such patient devotion since her arrival. When Alistair finally kissed his new wife, the assembled gathering erupted into joyful applause, the sound echoing warmly across grounds that had once known only silence and sorrow. Following the ceremony, a celebration feast was held in the manor's dining hall, the very room where Alara had first served her humble stew to a skeptical duke so many months before. The long table, once dusty and forgotten, now gleamed beneath careful polish, set with fine linens and abundant dishes prepared by Alara herself, alongside Bridget and several other kitchen staff who had grown skilled under her patient guidance. Baron Vane, notably absent from the celebrations, had reportedly withdrawn entirely from any further attempts to challenge Ashcombe land claims, his earlier defeat having thoroughly discouraged any renewed ambitions regarding the estate. His absence went largely unnoticed amid the genuine joy filling the manor's halls that day, the household far too consumed with celebrating the remarkable happiness that had blossomed within these walls to spare much thought for a man whose bitter ambitions had ultimately failed against the strength of a home rebuilt through patience and love. As evening settled gently over Ashcombe Manor, the celebration gradually quieted, guests slowly departing with warm wishes and genuine happiness for the newly married couple. Ilara and Alistair remained in the garden long after most guests had gone, standing together beneath the oak tree, where their journey toward this joyful moment had truly begun. "Do you remember?" Ilara said softly, leaning contentedly against her husband's shoulder as they watched the last light of sunset paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. "What you said to me, that very first night, when I promised to make this house a home." "I remember laughing," Alistair admitted, a warm smile touching his lips at the memory. "I believed you spoke from desperation alone, never truly considering that a simple bowl of stew might begin unraveling years of carefully guarded grief." "And do you believe now," Ilara asked, tilting her head to meet his affectionate gaze, "that I kept my promise?" "You kept it entirely," Alistair said, his voice carrying deep sincerity as he wrapped his arms gently around her. "You transformed this house from a place of silence and sorrow into a true home, filled with warmth, laughter, and love I believed permanently lost. And you have given me something even greater than a restored estate, Ilara. You have given me a partner to share this home with, someone whose courage and kindness continue reminding me daily of everything worth living for." Ilara felt tears of happiness gathering once more at the corners of her eyes, though these tears carried none of the sorrow or desperation that had accompanied her arrival at these very gates so many months before. "I promised to make this house a home," she said softly, "but I never expected, that stormy night, that this house would give me a home in return, filled with love I did not believe I deserved after everything I had lost." "You deserve every bit of happiness you have found here," Alistair said firmly, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring you continue feeling exactly that." As darkness settled fully over the garden, stars beginning their gentle emergence across the clear spring sky, Ilara and Alistair remained together beneath the ancient oak tree, their laughter mingling softly with the quiet rustle of new leaves overhead, a fitting symbol of new growth and renewed hope taking root within Ashcombe Manor's ancient stone walls. The manor itself, once described by fearful villagers as cursed and cold, now stood transformed entirely, its halls filled nightly with warmth, laughter, and the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals prepared by a woman who had arrived as a desperate stranger, seeking mere shelter, and remained to become the very heart of a household reborn. In the years that followed, Ashcombe Manor became known throughout the valley not for its former reputation of sorrow and isolation, but for its renowned hospitality, its beautifully tended gardens, and the genuine warmth radiating from a duke and duchess whose partnership had proven, quite remarkably, that even the coldest houses could learn once more how to hold love within their walls, given enough patience, courage, and one truly excellent bowl of stew. And though the villagers who had once driven Ilara away in fear and suspicion eventually heard whispers of her remarkable transformation, from desperate outcast to beloved duchess, none among them ever fully understood the true courage it had taken that stormy night, when a frightened young woman stumbled through unfamiliar gates and made a promise she scarcely believed herself capable of keeping. Yet keep it she did, one meal, one kindness, one quiet moment of genuine connection at a time, until an entire house, and the grieving man within it, learned once more how to call themselves truly, wonderfully home.